This is a 1991 Jaguar XJR 15, and it's the other Jaguar supercar. Everybody knows about the later XJ220, but this was rarer, and it has a V12 compared to the XJ220's six-cylinder. These are also worth around $2 million, although not that many people know what the XJR 15 is, but today you're going to know, because I'm going to give you a thorough review of this obscure supercar. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some fantastic sales recently, including this wonderful Shelby GT350R sold for almost $68,000. This fantastic 992 Porsche 911, which is wonderfully optioned, brought almost $169,000, and this Hummer EV sold for just under $230,000. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, the 1980s and up, Cars and Bids is the place to do it, with daily auctions and great selection at carsandbids.com. I've borrowed this XJR 15 from The Cultivated Collector, which is a dealership here in Connecticut that specializes in some of the most amazing, incredible, special cars in the history of the automobile, and is also a personal friend of mine. You can check out The Cultivated Collector by clicking the link in the description below, and you absolutely should follow them on social media, because you will see some amazing things with some amazing vehicles like this one. All right, time for the quirks and features of the XJR 15. And I'm going to start with a little overview of exactly what this car is. It may be hard to believe now, but in the late 1980s, Jaguar was quite successful in motorsport, and they even won Le Mans twice in partnership with a company called Tom Walkinshaw Racing. Now, in that era, Tom Walkinshaw Racing, TWR, they decided that they wanted to build a road-going version of the Le Mans winning race car to sell to people to drive on the street. And that's how the XJR 15 came to be. In the end, the XJR 15 was built by Jaguar Sport, which was a joint venture partnership between TWR and Jaguar. You can see the Jaguar Sport badge on the front. It also says XJR 15, and this Jaguar Sport decal across the windshield, which a lot of the XJR 15s had from new to celebrate this high-performance Jaguar racing partnership. Now, all XJR 15s were technically 1991 models, and the cost to buy one of these back then was around $980,000. That's in 1991 money, so it was an incredibly expensive car, but it was also essentially a road-going Le Mans winner car, which made it exceptionally cool, and so some people could justify spending that money, although not very many. Now, these were never street legal here in the United States in the period, and most of them were actually sold new into Japan, which was at the height of the Japanese bubble economy, where there was an insatiable appetite for crazy supercars like this one. Now, after the XJR 15 went out of production, Jaguar debuted its own supercar, the XJ220, which is of course far better known than the XJR 15, and that was a purely Jaguar project, not with TWR, not with Jaguar Sport. It was all Jaguar, whereas this was more of a race car slash partially Jaguar combo. But while the XJ220 is certainly better known than the XJR 15, this car holds a few distinct advantages over its later supercar successor. One is rarity. Jaguar made about 250, 270 XJ220s, but only 53 XJR 15s were made for the entire world, and only 28 of those were road cars. The rest were actually actually race cars that were sold to really rich people to drive as a track-only vehicle. So this is one of just 28 road-going versions of the XJR 15, incredibly rare. And these were also sold with a V12. It's a 6-liter V12 as opposed to the supercharged 6-cylinder in the XJ220, which was a cause of some disappointment when that car went on sale. But anyway, next up on to more of the quirks and features of the XJR 15, and certainly one quirk is that we can't really access the engine. This rear panel does come off, but it's not easy to do. This really was a race car converted to a road car, and so ease of use wasn't a major priority. They kept it very race car, and so to take off this rear engine lid, you had to remove the tires, you had to take off the fender liners, the rear grille, all sorts of different things, and only then could you pull off this panel. And it wasn't hinged. You had to lift it all off as one piece and take it away like on a race car. In fact, the cultivated collector who owns this car told me it's about an hour-and-a-half job just to get the panel off to get to the engine in this car. But the good news is that we can look through this rear glass here and see the engine. You have quite good visual access to it through here. And in fact, this is one of the very first cars that offered the ability to look through the glass and see the powertrain. The Ferrari F40 also had it in this era, and pretty much nothing else for a while. This was one of the beginnings. Now, you can see the powertrain here, and like I said, V12. This is a 6-liter V12 with about 450 horsepower and about 420 pound-feet of torque. That doesn't sound like much, but this car only weighed 2,300 pounds. It is exceptionally lightweight, especially considering that it has a V12 in it. Not too many V12 cars can get away with their curb weights being so light. Now, the result of the 12-cylinder engine and the low weight was 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds, which was truly impressive back in 1991, and a top speed of 191 miles an hour, which was also truly impressive back in 91. The other items worth noting with the engine, when you look in here, you can see the top cover part is painted yellow. That was done intentionally to match the car. The cars that are blue have it painted blue. It always matched the color of the XJR 15. And of course, you can see it also says XJR 15 printed on it in large letters, so you knew exactly what you were looking at. Interestingly, that plus the badge I showed you up front, the Jaguar Sport badge, the only things on the outside of this car that say XJR 15. You pretty much just had to know. But anyway, next up, another very interesting thing about the XJR 15 is it was the world's first car that was made from carbon fiber. The chassis, the tub, was all carbon fiber, which is common now, but obviously didn't exist at the time of this car until this car. And you can see the carbon fiber along the base of the windshield. That's the tub of this car. And you can also see when you open the door on the door sill, more carbon fiber in here. None of this is decorative. It was all the chassis of this car, and it was a totally crazy idea at the time, but they did it, and they were the first. But despite that little preview of the door sill carbon fiber area, I'm not ready to move inside just yet. There are still more quirks and features to discuss out here, including the wheels. These are center lock wheels with one big central locking hub in the center, like race cars and some modern supercars have. And you can see they are color coded. You have red center locks over on the left side and blue ones over on the right side to make sure you didn't put the wrong one on the wrong side when you were doing a fast pit stop. Race cars also have this, and of course so did the Porsche Carrera GT, my favorite car, red on one side and blue on the other. And speaking of things on different sides of the car, you can see this little fuel door here, except that's not a fuel door at all. It's for oil. If you want to add engine oil, you do it through there. It's a lot easier through this cap than taking off the entire rear shell in order to get at the oil, so you just stick it in there. Over on the other side, that's where you put in fuel. You definitely don't want to mess those up. One is oil, one is fuel, and you really got to keep it straight. Now, up front in the XJR 15, you can see pop-up headlights. They're in the down position right now, but you turn on the headlights and they pop up like a lot of supercars and sports cars from this era. And you also have a second set of lights below that. Those are your high beams. And the interesting part is you can just remove these covers. You can take it right off. It's Velcroed on. You can pull it off, and then you can access your high beams. They did this to make it easier to clean this area, and also obviously if you ever have to change those lights, you can do it very simply, just velcroed light covers. Haven't seen that one before. And by the way, speaking of lights, with the XJR15, the rear lights are rather interesting because they're shared with the Mazda MX-6. You can see the rear lights of the XJR15 here. This is the Mazda MX-6, and they have the same rear lights. Apparently Tom Walkinshaw, obviously the owner of TWR, apparently he also owns some Mazda dealerships, and so he was able to broker that deal to give this crazy multi-million-dollar supercar Mazda MX-6 taillights. Kind of funny. But anyway, next up, before I move inside, I want to talk general design and styling of this car, which I find to be interesting because it's swoopy. You can see it has sort of swoopy curves on the side, which I highlight as unusual because of the time period this car was in. Most late 80s, early 90s supercars were wedge-shaped with hard corners and edges, but not this one. And I really think this was one of the first cars that sort of ushered in that 90s era of swoops and curves in supercar and sports car design. Now, you can see integrated into the swoops on the side an air intake, obviously to bring air into the engine, and you can also see some vents back here to get heat out of the engine. You can see a few of them mounted on this rear compartment over the engine bay, and then this little panel, which looks like a third brake light. If you go around to the front, it isn't, and it actually is also some vents to help cool the engine, and you have a few more vents at the base of the rear window as well, again to help cool the engine in the back. But anyway, next up, earlier I mentioned that the rear engine compartment cover is difficult to access, but the same is not also true of the front. As you can see, it's open, and it's pretty easy to get it open. You open up the door, and there's a little tab you pull right here that unlocks it on one side. Then you go over to the other door, you pull the same tab there, that unlocks it on both sides, and then from there, you can just lift it up. It's hinged, it has hydraulics to keep it in place, and then it's up, and you've got access to your front compartment. And you can see it is then sitting in this position completely open. Unfortunately, you don't get any real practicality from being able to open this compartment. There's no storage compartment up here. You can see you have fans, you have your horn, you have a battery, some hoses. It's really all mechanical components up here, and there's no storage at all. Although it does give you access to look at some of the carbon fiber that creates the structure of this car, which is sort of a neat thing to see, especially for a car from this era where carbon fiber was totally non-existent, but it's right here under this compartment. But storage is not. But when it comes to the utter lack of storage and practicality you have on the outside of the car, the same is true on the inside of the car. This really was a race car first and a road car second, and I will show you that lack of practicality in a moment, but first we have to get in and let's talk key. You can see there's a keyhole mounted here on the door, and this is the key, this sort of weird little stubby Jaguar key. You stick that key in and it unlocks the door. And then to open the door, you stick your hand into this little divot in the rear fender directly behind the door, and there's a little latch that you kind of push up, and then the door opens up and you can get into the XJR15. But anyway, next we move inside the XJR15, and you can see my camera angle is a little different than normal, a little strange, and that's because the door barely opens. It only opens to here. That's the maximum opening of this door, and so getting in is a little bit of a technical challenge that requires some acrobatics, as you can see. But anyway, once you're inside this car, one of the first things you notice is the seats are tremendously close together, just right next to each other and basically in the middle of this interior. All XJR15 models were right-hand drive, but that's almost a technicality because it really feels like you're sitting centrally in this car, and the steering wheel is almost pointed towards the middle, as are the pedals, and so you really have almost more of a center seating position than an actual right or left seating position, which is common in Le Mans race cars, but not necessarily in road cars. But maybe in a road car that's adapted from a Le Mans race car, it makes sense. But anyway, the seats incredibly close together, so driver and passenger are right next to each other, and indeed the only thing in between the seats is the parking brake. That's it. Not even the gear selector is between the seats. That is over on the driver's right side, between the driver's seat and the door sill. That's where you'll find your gear selector in this car. Now, there are a few advantages to putting the gear lever over there. One is, obviously, it frees up space in between the seats so you can get them them closer together into the middle of this cockpit, but also it gives right-handed drivers a little bit of an advantage for grabbing the gear lever and changing gears. But the craziest thing about these seats is not how central they are, how close they are together, but rather that they include headsets. You can see them here. Headsets are included in both seats in this car, and they do that because this is loud. Race cars are loud with very little sound insulation, and so it's difficult to talk driver and passenger unless you have headsets. So they're built into this car. You can see they even say Jaguar Sport XJR 15. They were made for this vehicle, and this one still includes them. And the owner of this car, the Cultivated Collector, he told me that if you want to have real conversations while you're driving around in this car, you'll want to use the headsets to communicate because it is simply easier. And there's a control module for the headsets mounted directly between them. You can see driver, co-driver. You can adjust the volume and turn them on or off in this box, the in-car headset system in the XJR 15. Now, also in the headsets, you can see they're mounted on these headrests, which are actually kind of separate entities from the seats. The headrests themselves are not part of the seat. Instead, they're placed on this carbon fiber panel above the seat and entirely separate, and you can't move them. Although that's not a real big drawback because you can't move the seats either. They are fixed in place, and so the seats don't move, the headrests don't move. You better like the driving position if you're going to drive this car. But anyway, one other detail worth pointing out about the seats is the seat belts. You have a racing harness in here rather than a traditional 3-point belt, which of course makes sense since this really was a race car that was turned into a road car, and so you have a racing harness to go along with it. But anyway, moving on from the seats, one of the first things you notice after you sit down in this car is the sheer amount of carbon fiber everywhere. You have carbon fiber on the door sill like I showed you before, but it's the whole interior. The dashboard is part of the chassis, the tub, and so it's all carbon fiber the entire way across. And you can see carbon basically everywhere else too. Behind the seats, all carbon fiber. The door panel, all carbon fiber. It's all carbon in here. And again, none of this is decorative. It was used to save weight. It was tremendously expensive at the time, and it significantly increased the cost of this vehicle, but it was revolutionary, and many more cars started using carbon fiber construction after this one essentially pioneered it. But anyway, back to the gear selector in this car. The gear lever, like I said, it is to the right of the driver's seat, and you can see it here, and it is a 5-speed manual, which was generally the convention even on sports cars and supercars in the early 90s. Now, this is a 5-speed manual with gear synchro mesh. However, there was an optional 6-speed manual without synchro mesh if you wanted to do it. That would be more of a race car transmission, and so for people who felt they were really hardcore, they could go for that transmission instead, but this car has the normal one. But anyway, speaking of that area over by the gear lever, there are quite a few controls over there, as you can see, and one of them is the starting procedure. In order to start this car, the first thing you do is flip this giant red switch. This is your battery cutoff. You flip it from off, where the battery is cut off and you can't do anything, to on, and then the battery is going and you can start up the car. And to do that, all you gotta do is flip these 4 switches. You can see ignition, injectors, pumps, and start. You flip those 4 in a certain order, and that starts the engine, and then you can drive your XJR 15. Now, if you're paying attention, you're thinking, oh, wait a sec, there's no key to start this car. And indeed, that's true. Race cars don't have a key, and this, adapted from a race car, doesn't have a key, which is odd because I showed you a key earlier to lock and unlock the doors. So indeed, this car has a door key, but that is not necessary to actually get it started and get it going. So these came with keys, but only for the doors, which was and is rather unusual. But anyway, a few other interesting controls in this area. This one is for the fire suppression system. You can see it's behind this little plastic door because you don't want to press it by accident. If you push it, it shoots like fire suppressant foam onto the interior, the engine bay, and that stuff takes forever to remove and clean out. So that's behind a door to make make sure you really want to press it when you're ready to press it. Fire suppression, of course, not common in road cars, but it is common in race cars, so it makes sense that this sort of pseudo race car has it. Other controls up here, not all that surprising. You have a rear fog light. You turn that on in foggy or rainy conditions, so people can see you if they're coming up from behind. You also have this button marked emergency, which is your hazard lights. You press that and your hazards go on. Not particularly unusual. This switch, though, is weird. That is your climate control system. That one switch controls it all. If you press cool, it turns on your AC, and then air conditioning will blow out from these vents here, which you can see directly below the windshield, although you can move them to blow in your face if you want. But that's the only control you have with the AC system. You can't change the fan speed. You can't make it blow at your feet. You can't change the temperature. You just press on and it's on, and you deal with what it gives you. And the same is true for the heating system. If you press down heat, also heat comes out and you just deal with what it gives you. That's the entire climate controls for this car, just this one single switch. Now, there is one other control over here. You can see this green button marked HFS, which stands for heated front screen. You have a heated windshield in this car, which is a little bit of a curious feature because the seats don't move, and yet you have a luxurious heated windshield. The windows don't roll down in the doors. Instead, if you want to open up the windows, there's this little switch. You push it and you pop open this triangular panel, and that is the only way you can open up the windows in the XJR 15. They don't roll down. It doesn't have real windows, just these little cutouts that pop open. That's all you get. And yet you have a heated front windshield. Doesn't really make any sense. Do you need to clear ice from your windshield while you're racing? I'm not really sure, but it has it, an odd luxury touch in this otherwise very stripped down car. By the way, one other item worth pointing out with these little windows I just showed you that open up, when you have them open, the owner of this car, the Cultivated Collector, they told me that a lot of heat pours in through those windows because directly in front of them, in front of you in the car, you have your radiator, and so heat comes out of there and flows directly down this line and into the windows. And so it's actually cooler if you keep the windows closed while driving this car, because otherwise heat will come through them and directly into the passenger compartment. But anyway, next up, speaking of the windows and specifically the doors that they're mounted on, you can see the doors are tremendously basic. Carbon fiber door panel, like I showed you earlier, but all you get is a strap, a handle basically to close the door, and then a latch to open it up again. And that is it. Basic door for a basic car, and it's tremendously lightweight. This door is incredibly easy to open or close. It must only weigh a couple pounds, and it's very interesting and very simple. But anyway, next up, the rest of this interior, and specifically focusing on the controls and dials ahead of the driver. For one, you have the steering wheel, of course. In the middle, the Jaguar Sport XJR 15 badge, which is very cool. The bottom of the steering wheel is not round, as you can see, and they do that as a cutout for your legs. So when you're sitting here, you have a little bit more leg room and knee room with the steering wheel in its kind of resting straight ahead position. You also have, to the left of the wheel, a stalk coming off, which is your turn signals and your windshield wipers, and at the end of the stalk, you press it for your horn. Now, as for the gauge cluster, you can see there's nothing too unusual here. Oil pressure, oil, battery voltage, speedometer, tachometer, water temperature, pretty standard gauge cluster situation in this car. And also mounted on the gauge cluster, you have your headlight control, which is this little dial here. You can turn on your parking lights or you can turn on your full headlights. Pretty standard, straightforward stuff. Also worth pointing out in the gauge cluster, you have a few warning lights, 6 of them to be specific. Along the top, you have these colored rectangles, green, orange, red, and blue, and then below that, 2 circles, one green and one red. And these turn on to illuminate, like if your turn signals are on, one of them will blink. I think the blue is for high beams, maybe red is for low oil pressure, that sort of thing. Basically just your warning lights in the XJR 15. Unlabeled, but at least you get warning lights, which is a nice feature to have. But anyway, other items worth noting in this interior. For one thing, there are no sun visors in this car. And a lot of supercars, they're really small. In this car, you just don't get them. But you do have a roll cage, as you can see, going across the entire interior. Obviously, that's a pretty standard race car touch, and so naturally it's carried over into this, which is essentially a race car for the road. And by the way, one interesting thing about adapting the XJR 15 to become a road car, supposedly the interior actually grew for the road car. supposedly Jaguar and TWR made the interior 3 inches wider for the road car to give regular people more space, and they made the roof 1.5 inches taller, again for more interior room. The race car, you can make those compromises, but a road car, people want more comfort, and so they did that. Also interesting about the XJR 15, it became the Nissan R390. Apparently, after Jaguar abandoned racing in the early 90s, not long after this car came out, Nissan went to TWR and asked for help developing a race car of their own. TWR had already developed this car and used the same tub and the same cockpit structure and design to make the R390, which became a successful race car for Nissan. In fact, at Le Mans in 1998, Nissan entered 4 R390s and all 4 finished in the top 10, which was a pretty impressive finish. And it was on this car that the R390 had its basis. And you can obviously see some similarities between the two, and that's because they shared a lot of things. And so those are the quirks and features of the Jaguar XJR 15. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the XJR 15. How cool is this? First thing, in here you realize this really is a race car. It is tight, it is loud, you hear everything, you feel everything. Every vibration, everything in the pavement, you hear it, you feel it, you see it. And so from a comfort standpoint, it is tremendously rough in this car. But the benefit is you get an amazing driving experience. First off, the shifter is fantastic. The pedals are pretty tight, which makes it a little difficult if you have bigger feet like I do. But the clutch and shifter action is amazing. The shifter feels so incredible. Bolt action, like really, really tight when you shift into gear. It's so wonderfully put together. The shifter and clutch just feel fantastic if you can get your foot around the clutch. The other thing that's really amazing about this car is the steering and handling is just incredible. Just really, really fantastically connected. Obviously, just the moment you change direction of the steering wheel, the car changes direction. It's really amazing. Then there's the acceleration. Wow! Wow! It's really fast and it revs really, really quickly. I'm actually surprised, woo, by just how fast it revs. It really goes. Now, 450 horsepower, not a huge amount of power, but in a car this size, it does feel huge. 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds, you can kind of understand it. I mean, this car is really, really quick, and it feels really fast because you're so low and you're so close to the road. I also just love the way it steers and feels. Any little direction change in the steering wheel changes the direction of the car. You got to be on it. It really does feel like a race car. And also in that vein, visibility is a disaster. The mirrors are really small, and the rear view mirror in the middle is big, but when you look out, the rear glass isn't glass, it's some plexi thing, and it distorts everything. Listen to that! Listen to that! That's amazing! That's what a race car sounds like, just an enormous amount of sound. Woo! Really quick to rev when you want to do a rev match downshift, just ready to go. Very fun. There is a little more vagueness on center than I was expecting, but that was true of a lot of cars from this area. You got about a 1/4 inch play in each direction. But when you're actually going around a corner, you aim and it goes. It is incredibly precise and incredibly fast to change direction. Very few modern cars steer this quickly, let alone this. I'll tell you, it really does feel like a race car, like a Le Mans race car on the road. I've driven a lot of cars that are sports cars that are sort of race car-y, like people in their GT3 RSs. They think they're driving a race car. It ain't nothing compared to this. This is what a race car is like. Very loud. The headsets would help considerably if you had a passenger that you were trying to talk to. It's loud in here. It's very rough. It's very tight. And the car is just unbelievably fast and responsive. 2,300 pounds. That's an amazing figure. And that is what a race car is all about. Stripping out unnecessary items like sun visors so that you can just have a full, brutal experience. Now, I mentioned earlier this car is more center drive than right drive, and that's kind of true. Although sitting here driving it, you do feel more right-hand drive than anything else. So you got to kind of check that while you're driving it along. I will say I drove an XJ220, and the experience is unbelievably different. This car is so much more brutal, so much more race car, so much more focused, hardcore sports car. The XJ220, there was a comfort element to it. This car is nothing like that. Even though they both are Jaguars from the same era, XJ in the name, these cars are radically, radically different. And this really does feel like the race car that it is. And all those things I showed you before, race car adapted for the road, when you drive it, you feel that. It's a race car. I'll tell you this, the ride is rough, but this car is based on a Le Mans winning race car. If you want a true race car experience on the road, there are very few cars that offer it. There are road cars that offer a more stripped down experience, but this car has a true race car feel to it like very few others, and it is an unbelievable thing to imagine cruising around in this. It really is something. Listen to those squeaky brakes, just like a race car. Oh, yeah! God, it feels so fast. It just feels so fast because it's so loud and you're so close to the road. What an amazing experience. I love it. It's so cool. If you want a true race car for the road experience, this is that. And it is quite something to drive this car and to feel it, and to feel just how race car-y something can be on the road. This car is really amazing. It's quite an experience. And so that's the Jaguar XJR 15. This is an amazing car with an amazing story, an amazing performance, and incredible rarity. There are precious few videos out there about the XJR 15, but hopefully this one gave you a thorough look at one of the most obscure and interesting supercars of its era. Anyway, now it's time to give the XJR 15 a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 57 out of 100, which places the XJR 15 here against other similar cars. The XJR 15 has an impressive showing in the weekend categories, beating out very special cars like the Vector W8, Porsche 959, and Bugatti EB110. But it loses ground in the daily categories. No surprise, since the XJR 15 is effectively a race car for the road, and daily driving it would be massively difficult. And indeed, the XJR 15 isn't comfortable, nor is it iconic or globally celebrated like the Ferrari F40 or Porsche 959, which are well-known icons. Instead, the XJR 15 is ultra rare and rather obscure, making it something of a connoisseur's car, at least for the connoisseur who wants more of a race car than a road car.